Hopefully it comes up correctly. Okay. Amy, can you verify you're seeing the right presentation here? Okay, great. I got to get my other controls here. Everything's kind of all over the place when I did that. Sorry about this. Make sure I have my... There we go. Okay. So our agenda today, just want to talk a little bit about the process, kind of how we got to the study that we're doing or that we're showing you today. Go over some of the findings from the survey and other input we did, as well as a market analysis, and then directions forward and the strategies and recommendations that came out of the study. So for this process, we kind of take it through for housing studies, three kind of steps. One is kind of our discovery phase, where we're gathering our market data, understanding the local conditions, and then talking to people throughout the community. So we held a series of listening sessions with folks throughout the county and a lot of different areas, and we're able to gain a lot of insights in that process. The second part, we kind of use that information to identify gaps and opportunities in the housing market, to develop kind of an action plan and strategic goals. And then we define those goals with policies and initiatives that could be used to address those issues or challenges that we identified. I will note, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, this is a Story County housing study. However, it does not explicitly go into detail for the city of Ames. It does obviously consider Ames's influence on other communities in Story County, but it does, the detailed information focuses on the other communities and unincorporated areas in the county. So first, jumping into some of the market survey findings. We did administer a survey throughout last fall, and then did a second push in December as well for folks that to get more folks to respond to the survey. We had about over 670 people respond. You can see here, we're going to go through just a few of the highlights, not every question, but you can see here question 1 and 2 that we asked folks to kind of understand what the market is like. We asked the adequacy of whether the housing in the county meets certain people's needs, and this shows the percent responding yes. You can see kind of the lowest ranking groups were multi-generational families and seasonal workers. The highest ranking was students, which is not all that surprising, considering there's students make up a large portion of Ames and Story County. We then asked if you were looking for a new place to live in the next 3 years. 47% said they're happy with their current living arrangement, but 67% said they would consider moving within Story County in the next 3 years. These don't equal 100% because we allowed people to choose more than one item, but that really shows there's people looking for new options and new product types. Maybe they're not moving because their product isn't available, or they're just kind of waiting for the financial situation to be different. So with that, we asked kind of people's experiences in the past as well. So one thing we asked was their perceived availability for certain rent categories if they've looked for housing in the past 3 years. You can see here a clear gap in the areas rentals below $1,000 a month that people were indicating, and then kind of a more of a balance, although a lot of people seeing oversupply for rentals priced above $1,000 a month. When we look at that from the owner side, for folks that looked at ownership options in the past 3 years, not as stark of cutoff, although the cutoff tends to be around that $200,000 mark, where folks are saying under that there's an undersupply. Over that, people tended to say there was more of a balance in the housing market. So then we asked people what their feelings were on using kind of public funding to support various programs and things to support the housing market. One thing we did ask specifically was about property maintenance codes. public funding to remove dilapidated housing, and public funding for rehab programs. You can see that rehab programs in dilapidated housing ranked the highest, and not surprisingly, there are some of these programs already in place in Story County, and folks see a need for those, and perhaps even expanding those programs. So moving into the data component, kind of uh, coupling that with what we heard from people, we look at the data as well to try to marry the two together, see if they match, and if they don't match, why is that? And we ask those types of questions. You can see here the population change by city from 1990 to 2018. As you all probably know, almost all cities in the county are growing. This is by a percent change, so you can see Huxley has the largest percent change of growth in that time period, followed by Gilbert and Ames. Zering was the only community that had a negative percent change, although the percent change was almost zero, so it was not a huge decline. It was pretty much a steady population. Residential construction activity, you can see here kind of a lot going on in this graph, but we have the countywide total housing permits constructed since 2010. The greenish lines here are just the unincorporated areas in the county. These numbers do not include the city of Ames, so these are everything except Ames. You can see it took a little bit of time after the 2008 recession to kind of bounce back up to full housing production, with the highest years in 2016 and 2017. But really, most of this has been dominated by single family development. Not very much in terms of multifamily. A little bit of duplex and attached dwellings in recent years, but about 80% of all new construction has been the single family model. And then thinking about the existing homes that are on the market, and how those homes are turning over, and what type of movement there is within the Story County housing market. You can see here MLS data for home sales in the past 2017 to 2019. And this is for single family home sales. Our average sale price has increased pretty much with inflation. It's a little bit over inflation, but average has been going up expectedly, as well as the numbers sold has generally went up. 392 in 2019, 367 in 2017. So more homes are being sold, but days on market also going up. So that really indicates to us 47 is a pretty low number for the number of days on market. We know that many homes, especially those that are kind of the hot types of homes, single family, 2 to 3 bedroom ranch styles, will sell within a day. But the average of 47 is pretty low. So that number going up indicates that maybe there's a really low inventory. And so the homes that are driving that up are the unique homes that have been on the market for a long time. They have a hard time selling. And the other products just aren't available. They're not even on the market. So transitioning from that, we did a deep dive in the study. I should say there's a lot of information in the study we're not including in this presentation just for the sake of time. But one thing we do look at in detail is affordability metrics. You can see here some comparisons with other counties around the Midwest. These are similar counties in the sense of having a university, kind of similar demographics, and also population size. And you can see Story County's median income, median house value, uh, uh, contract rent. And one item we like to look at is called a value to income ratio. What that is really a comparison of what the median home values are in a county versus the median incomes, to kind of give us a sense of how much people are spending on housing, and whether the housing market is considered affordable or unaffordable for people living there. Um, Generally, that number, we like to say between 2 and 3 is considered kind of the target area for affordability. You'll notice all of these counties are above 3, and that's really a factor of the student population. They tend to drive up this number because they have low incomes that drive down median household income. but they're not necessarily living in a house. They're living in rental units or condos and such, or dormitories and such. But you will notice that Story County is a little bit lower than some of its other counties from this measure. When we look at that same measure by the largest communities in the county, you can see Ames being a factor that drives up the countywide average with their value to income ratio above 4. When we look at the other communities, they're generally within that 2 to 3 range as far as value to income ratio. So we're not seeing a drastic amount being well above 3 or below 2 in that range. So that really means that the market should be good for continued building activity from the development community. Looking at percent changes in affordability, percent changes in rent, income, and home values. Um, this graph just kind of illustrates that incomes have not been rising as much as rent and median home value on average. You can see the yellow bars here illustrating the percent change in median rent since 2010. And a lot of cities, that is quite a bit higher than the change in income, which is the dark blue here. Not all communities, but many, and then Story County as a whole, which Ames probably factors into a little bit as well. So these are things we were hearing in the listening session as well, and leads into some of the strategies to address these issues that Amy will be talking about in a little bit. Kind of the last measure of affordability that we like to look at is kind of a comparison of what the existing housing stock is and the price point of that housing stock versus what people's incomes are that would tend to live in a house priced at that price point. So this chart, and again, it's not, I'll try to summarize it and not be too detailed, but for example, it looks at a house, for example, a household making between, we'll use the 75 to $100,000 household income range. For that house, we would categorize, or for that household, we would categorize what would be considered an affordable home between $200 and $250,000. Affordable rent between $15 and $2,000 a month. There's about 1,900 households within this income range in Story County, not including Ames. There's about 1,300 homes within a $200 to $250,000 price point, and about 46 rentals in that price point. So what that means is for this household income category, there's actually fewer homes that would meet what they could afford than what's available on the market, which means these households are buying homes or living in apartments in other price points, likely in the price point below them. So where it says surplus here for the households with $50 to $75,000 annual income, actually is probably partially occupied by the upper income group, where they have a gap in their service. So this really just tells us and illustrates to us kind of the variations of where maybe there's demand in the market at certain price points, and how people are moving throughout the market at different price points where they're looking to buy and having no choice to buy. I won't go into this in detail, but we do provide in the study a detailed population and housing demand forecast for largest communities. You can see here the kind of population forecast. Obviously, we project all the cities in Story County to continue to grow in the future, which translates into kind of a projected housing need for the future through 2040. The model in the plan comes to about 3,000 units needed through 2040. And that's across a variety of price points and a variety of communities, which shows here kind of the breakdown of where potentially that demand could be filled at. With Huxley, obviously having a lot of that need filled in Huxley, and then the other communities shown here as well. One thing we did notice, and we heard this in the listening sessions and the survey as well, is the housing conditions in Story County are actually are quite good relative to other counties that we work in and travel to. So we do provide some maps in the plan breaking down kind of condition ratings by various communities. Um, but again, we're seeing most homes be in this very good to normal condition. Very few areas of widespread dilapidation and poor condition housing in the county. Um, so then jumping into kind of our strategies to address some of our findings, I just quickly want to go over some of the issues we discovered and some opportunities for the strategies as well, before handing it over to Amy. You can see here kind of some of the main issues to overcome. We have the locational benefits and drawbacks of Story County being close to the Des Moines Metro and Ankeny. Obviously, that spurs a lot of growth, but also is starting to tend to drive up prices in certain areas of the county. Limited options for first-time homebuyers. We heard from a lot of folks in our listening sessions that a teacher, for example, moving to getting a job in Story County is hard to find them an option to even not just to rent it, but if they wanted to buy, to find an option that was affordable. Available land for housing. This just comes down to lot development and trying to stimulate more lot development in communities. Transportation between communities. A lot of the services in Story County are in Ames. So ensuring that there's adequate transportation options for those that don't have a car or cannot transport themselves to the services they need. External economic conditions, these are things we really can't control, but things we need to be aware of, like increases in building material costs, obviously a recession or a pandemic, but things that are issues to overcome. Hidden housing burden, addressing our lowest income housing households, homelessness, and those sorts of things we heard about quite a bit as well from various listening sessions. Other housing costs such as daycare and transportation are things that we consider in our strategies for the total cost of housing for somebody to live in Story County. And then technology, these are things you're doing a lot already, but trying to make broadband accessible to everyone, and enhancing that for people living in Story County. And then for opportunities to leverage, obviously I mentioned the high quality housing stock is something to continue to build on. That is really the most affordable housing in the county. There is a demand for rentals at all price points, not just the low price points, but price points that maybe, like I said, a teacher or someone would find affordable. A lot of people move to Story County for the communities and the schools, so that is something that is going to continue to spur growth in the future. There is an active development community that is doing work in a variety of communities in Story County, and that we expect that to continue in the future just because of your proximity to Des Moines Metro and the number of developers available in the region. There are many services for the underserved. Like I said, most of them are focused in Ames, although are some in other communities as well. And then clearly there's a demand for new housing in the future that we need to be working to fill. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy to kind of go through the strategies to address those opportunities and issues and kind of some of our recommendations moving forward.
Thanks, Charlie. So as I was preparing and thinking about this presentation last night and today, I was had reflected on a comment that I heard from an individual at one of the Lieutenant Governor's sessions on housing about a year or so ago. And it was around the fact of somebody pulled out a pamphlet and said, we've been talking about housing since the 1990s. And so for those of you who might not be aware, we had completed the Story County Housing Study in the late 1990s, 1999 or so, 98, 99. And I was reflecting on that a little bit when thinking about strategies and how we address the housing issues and what had really changed. Why is housing continuing to still sometimes be a struggle in our communities? Well, there's some interesting things that one thing I thank goodness for Google, right? So I Googled, and the average mortgage interest rate at that time was 7%. Today, we're at about 3%. So a lot of strategies talked about how to get individuals into housing. We had a lot of baby boomers still raising their families. We had Gen Xers like myself turning into first-time home buyers who were also looking to buy. So there was a lot of focus on how do we help people get into housing. Since then, we've seen great growth, but we've also seen the Great Recession where we saw wages stagnate while building construction materials continued to increase in costs. And we also saw a lot of people just get out of the building trade business during the recession. So all of those things kind of accumulating into a lot of the things that we saw, we heard in the listening sessions and saw Charlie pointing out in some of the data that we saw. So there's some great things that I think came out of the work that was done in the late 90s and have really laid some great base work. And we're going to touch on a couple of those, but we also need to kind of pivot and look at some of the changes that have happened and how the housing market and demand has changed over that time. Go ahead, Charlie, to the next slide. I want to start with kind of what an overarching goal that we think really begins to then filter down to a lot of the other goals and strategies that we're going to talk about, and that is risk sharing. So today in the market, it's not that we don't have anything getting built. We do have obviously homes being built, units being built, but we are also seeing that there's a demand in places where the private market says, boy, I don't know if I can be successful, or the risk is really high. My profit margins just aren't as great. So one of the things that kind of percolates down through is where can we find opportunities to share risk that will then make it more appealing sometimes for the private market to be involved and produce products that we need within our market. So beginning with some of those tools, and I've got a couple things grayed out here because I'm going to talk about them a little bit more later on. Public-private partnerships and nonprofits being really important as we move forward in thinking about this. Go ahead, Charlie. On the public-private partnership piece, we have a lot of different opportunities, and I want to start first about funding. I always kind of like to talk about funding at the beginning of these two, because you talk about different strategies and different programs, and then you usually hear, okay, well, how do we fund that? So why don't I answer that question from the very beginning, right? There's some different strategies we can have out there. Trust fund is one of them, which actually already exists within Story County. So we have the Story County Housing Trust Fund, which focuses on the communities outside of Ames and Story County. This might just be a really great time. That's been in place for a number of years. It's a good opportunity to maybe review their bylaws and directives and say, is it meeting our current needs? Do we need to tweak it a little bit? And how can we build its capacity, build its endowment a little bit more? Another strategy that we would see some communities use, and sometimes it's an either or on the trust fund and the lending consortium. And a lending consortium is a way to bring a lot of times our local banking community together to distribute risk. So if we got a project that we think might be a little bit riskier, it's a way for one institution not to take on all of that risk. But it can work in many different ways. We are also seeing today that our major employers are interested in being partners in addressing this issue, because really housing does get back to workforce recruitment and retention for them in a big way. And when I first got into doing this 20 some years ago, a lot of what employers did was, we'll cover moving costs. We'll help you get moved and help you get into a unit. Well, the issue we see today is there isn't a unit. So the moving costs are nice, but if I don't have a unit to move into, that doesn't help me out too much. So employers are beginning to play more of a role, and there's great opportunities for partnerships and a full range of pieces there, from an employer saying, my comfort level is I'll add some money to the trust fund or to a lending consortium that will assist in getting housing that's built for my employees, to the other end of the spectrum of saying, hey, we have some property that we could actually, help share or give it a reduced cost. We've seen that where we can get housing built for our employees to actually constructing housing for employees. So that kind of full range, and it really does depend on the employer's comfort level there. Obviously, our realtors, builders, and developers are also going to play an important role in being partners in this and how we continue to move forward. And sometimes it might be the fact that maybe the realtor takes a little bit less on commission, but hey, we have a house that's on the market that hopefully they get to sell a couple more times over and get that full commission off of. On the nonprofit side, we do have a nonprofit developer existing within Story County. So we usually encourage the development of a nonprofit developer to specifically work in the areas in which the private market cannot be successful. So they're going to do the projects where we have to maybe break even, or we might even lose a little bit and we're going to have to find gap financing in places. So they're not there to compete with the private market. They're going to work in the places where the private market can't be successful. So we do have a nonprofit. It's based in Ames. Right now, where it's at kind of capacity and funding wise, a lot of its focus has been on Ames. So one of the things we're encouraging is let's look at ways that we can expand maybe their capacity. There's no reason to necessarily reinvent the wheel and create another one within Story County. How could we potentially expand their capacity to be working in maybe some of the other communities? And the work they can do can be focused on rehab or could be focused on new construction too. Okay, go ahead. So one of the things that's really important to as we move forward is how do we continue to create a supply of affordable lots? So kind of the basic rule of thumb is that usually the lot is going to be probably about 20% of the final sale of the home. So if your lot is $60,000, you're not going to end up with a $200,000 house on that lot. The numbers just don't really work out. So we've got to find ways if we want to produce things that are maybe in those lower 200s, we've got to find ways to produce some lots that are maybe a little bit more affordable. So there's different ways that we could potentially do that. I will say the special assessments, the first thing that's listed on here, it is a way to maybe lessen that cost of the lot, but ultimately the homeowner is going to be paying higher taxes because they've got to pay off that special. So it doesn't maybe necessarily lower the final monthly cost for the homeowner. That we could do things like subordinate payments where it has a little bit different interest rate or isn't part of the larger mortgage piece of it. We also, I think, need to continue to have some pretty serious conversations around urban versus rural infrastructure with water, sewer, and et cetera. There's some areas where we could maybe be producing some fairly affordable lots, but the issues between rural and municipal water just create some issues that it makes it difficult to do, or the cost of getting that infrastructure into those areas makes it challenging to do. We also just need to continue to look at ways that we can leverage cost sharing around good design and character things. So Story County, as we mentioned, has a great stock of quality housing, has a lot of great character in your communities, and you want to maintain that in any new development, right? I mean, we can build cheap stuff that looks like a box with some windows punched into it, but that doesn't really fit the character of the community. So when we're sometimes asking for a little bit more trees, additional sidewalks, all of those things that might give and add to the character of a community, how can we begin to share some of those costs, bringing down the final sale price of the home? Go ahead. Land assembly can also be really important because we maybe have sites that have existing infrastructure or an older dilapidated use on it. So how do we begin to, and this is a lot of times a role that cities or economic development groups can help pay. A developer a lot of times is not going to want to work with multiple property owners to assemble that land. So that's an important role that our cities or economic development groups can begin to play. Go ahead, Charlie. We can also be leveraging some risk sharing around kind of product requirements. So how can we create some new policies and incentives that can help us produce products that are kind of missing products that we have? So this is an important part where maybe our trust fund dollars or lending consortium could be helping out in products that maybe aren't as common. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but what sometimes will be referred to as the missing middle housing, if you're kind of familiar with some of the newer buzz terms around in the housing realm. We also think there's some great opportunities for continued downtown and commercial building reuse. So in our downtowns, do we have some second story opportunities where we could partner building owners with people who kind of know how to do those conversions? Also, we're seeing more and more conversion of older commercial buildings into some very unique uses, or at least older commercial corridors that aren't being used in the same way, because our commercial environment before COVID was changing dramatically already. And now it probably continues to, especially as we think about kind of some of the older commercial corridors, not so much the downtowns and kind of our niche businesses. The other piece that we think is really exciting that we've seen some communities do, and that's some prepackaged site plans. So a lot of times developers, one of the hurdles for them can be how can we produce something that is that we know is going to make it through the development process smoothly. And this is really important when we start thinking about rental units. So one of the things, again, you know, how do we expand those rental units? Well, and across all age groups. That we have seen in a number of communities, not necessarily always in Story County, but in a lot of other places we've worked, in a lot of other counties we worked, some concerns people sometimes have over rental development. So when you can make that process smoother for the developer, time is money. And so when we can cut back on some of the time that it can take to get through an approval process by having something that's prepackaged, that the city will say, if you do this, you're going to move through that approval process faster and smoother, reducing some of their soft costs and making that process just a lot easier. We also need to look at ways that we can foster some of our grassroots efforts. So again, we're seeing this in both the owner and rental side. But how do we begin to develop a group of maybe housing advocates? So if we think that a new product or something that seems unfamiliar, we actually, Charlie and I ran into this just this week in talking with another community, not in Story County, actually in Kansas, of people having actually a poor perception of duplexes, which we thought was an interesting one. We don't really usually hear that. I think it's actually probably the number and the scale of them that they have in this location. But how do we create a group of housing advocates that can come in and say, hey, we really need this product. We have empty nesters and seniors that want to downsize in our communities, and they need a product type like a duplex or a townhome that's a lower maintenance product. So making sure we have those advocates that can come and speak to those things. Beginning to also continue to recruit and create opportunities for skilled trades. This is across the board. It's not just Story County. It is in everywhere across the entire United States, that need for additional skilled trades. We have a lot of those individuals who are nearing their retirement age. I think the average age of plumbers is close to 50 or more in some places. So we need to find ways to find the next generation. We also had a lot of those individuals who left during the recession. So how do we continue to recruit them? And then we already talked a little bit about the prepackaged pieces. I'd also like to emphasize, how do we also find our next generation of risk takers within our communities? That's another thing. We talk about the skilled trades kind of moving on and nearing retirement age, but I've seen plenty of developers and builders who are in those age range too. How do we find the next generation of skill takers who are risk takers who are willing to work in our communities? We also need to find ways to proactively preserve our existing housing stock. So I think this was one of the questions we had in the chat box too, was around kind of housing rehab and housing and removal of dilapidated structures. So one step in that process is going to be our code enforcement. We see a lot of times that our smaller communities, say like a Zeering, they're going to say, boy, we, to budget to have an employee who that's what they do. We don't have that in our budget, and we don't really have the demand to keep somebody full-time busy that way. But if we could work together with a group of communities in the county in a similar situation to share a resource like that, that would be great. So that's a good first step in that process. Continuing to invest in kind of neighborhood pride programs. Again, overall housing quality is really good. So let's make sure we're continuing to maintain that. Around the removal also of dilapidated structures, traditionally, a lot of times what I've seen is that funding source coming from the outside, say state or federal resources, can sometimes be pretty challenging to find. What I've usually found is the most successful is a community just says, you know, on an annual basis within our regular budget, we're going to try to budget for the removal of one or maybe two houses, depending on how their overall housing condition is. And we're just going to try to have that within the budget. That's probably, to be blunt, that's probably the most successful approach that I've seen. And with the overall housing condition being pretty good, that's probably a pretty good strategy there. Housing rehab programs, your regional COG, the Housing Trust Fund, all of those can begin to be good resources for funding for more rehab programs. But one of the things that we also saw is that there are programs out there. People just don't know about them. So we need to be making sure people are aware and know a little bit more about those programs. I think in one of the questions we got, is there a website? That would actually be one of the things that we would recommend, is that there needs to maybe be a little bit more of a central location that people could go to find those resources, so people are learning a little bit more about them. And then finally,
Amy,
and I did see another question came in. Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
Nope, I was just going to point that question out to you. So
yeah, I didn't read it though. So
okay, yeah, no, I'll bring it up now since I think it's related to this slide. This is Barb saying we have a property in downtown Cambridge that is designed for apartments and businesses. How do we get a developer interested in a project like that?
So that's a good question. I think one, it depends. So first of all, sometimes it's who owns it. So if the city owns the property, I usually actually encourage the city to almost give it away. And which to some people sounds a little crazy, but if it's really not generating much in property tax right now, you're going to recoup that by the redevelopment of it. So again, as we talked about, I think in a previous one of kind of creating an RFP. So basically it says, if you develop it in this way or do these things, you can almost have it, and that can be worked out in the deal. That can be one approach. Again, it depends on who owns the property. The other piece of it that I would just encourage, and this goes back to kind of finding our local risk takers. There's a lot of people out there who are really busy doing stuff in their own communities. And so to find those individuals sometimes that want to come and go do things in other communities can be pretty challenging. So I think it's Fairfield, right, Charlie? They brought together a group of investors to get some projects done. So that would be another way that I would encourage to think about that, is how could we maybe bring together a group of investors who might want to take on the project? They're maybe not the contractor swinging the hammer. We're going to hire a contractor from somewhere in the region to do that, but they might be the risk takers that help take that on a little bit more. Was there another question that popped up, Charlie?
Barb was just saying the city owns it, but has started to develop it. I'm not sure if she means, but has not started to develop it. But yes, it sounds like the city owns it.
Yeah. So that's usually, I usually tell communities, I know it's very tempting to explain to your taxpayers that we're going to try and recoup whatever costs we have in it through the sale of it. But really, if you sit there and hold on to it for 10 years because you're trying to sell it at what you have into it, what would have been better to about give it away and have had 10 years of increased property tax valuation coming from that and providing housing and businesses you need in your community. So I know it's sometimes harder to explain, but that's usually one of the things that I encourage people to think about in a little bit different way than maybe communities have thought in the past sometimes. Finally, updating and maintaining, making sure we're not creating hurdles. So over the last 50 years, we put things in place sometimes within our land use and zoning codes that had the best of intentions at the time, but now we're realizing they've created some hurdles for housing products sometimes that we really need. So I mentioned that missing middle piece. So that can make it a little bit harder to do the townhomes or the duplex or the accessory dwelling units. All of those things that we're realizing are products that if we can do them can be a great way to one, have different options, affordable options within the market, and two, can help people meet a housing need at different stages of life. So, from being just entering the housing market to wanting to transition to something that's lower maintenance. So few things that we're suggesting in the plan. One is making sure communities have updated land use plans that look at ways that can be inclusive to different housing product types, and really go out and talk to residents about what they see that they need today, but also what they see in the future for their children that they want to move back or when they're ready to downsize. We also need to be thinking about ways that we can broaden the residential permitting to allow some more by right opportunities. So again, when a community says to us, well, you can do townhomes in our community, but you have to go through in the majority of the residential zoning districts in our community, it is required that you get a special use permit or a conditional use permit. Well, you have just added a step in the process for the developer, and it's back to time is money, right? And okay, so it's just another little step I've got to do, a little bit more hassle. I'm going to go on to the next community where that's easier to do. So finding those places where we can make it just outright. If it's a product we want and it's an appropriate zoning district, let's look at ways we can do that. And that really ties into the next piece of this too. And that's the encouraging, and this gets back a lot to the missing middle piece of how do we focus on design and not as much on density. If we're dealing with setbacks and lot sizes and parking, we should be getting a little less concerned about maybe the density. If it's a duplex, but it looks like a single family home, it meets the setback requirements, it has the parking it needs. Does it matter whether it's a duplex or a single family home? So again, if it's meeting the character, the lot size, all of those things, and that's really a big emphasis in the missing middle discussion too. So looking at those ways that we're not creating hurdles for ourselves and what we're trying to accomplish is the big message there. So happy to answer. I think that's our last slide on some of the implementation strategies. I'm happy to answer any additional questions that anybody has.
And I will say the study is posted on the county's website currently for folks to look at and digest a little more. Obviously, there's a lot of information, particularly from the data standpoint, that we just couldn't cover today with our time allotment. And frankly, I don't think you'd want to sit here for an hour and a half listening to that stuff. But yeah, so that the study is posted. Our schedule eventually here in the next month or two will be it'll be going to the county commissioners for review. But otherwise, right now it's kind of open for the public to digest and take a look at. I got a question here. In addition to posting this presentation, can you email it to those of us invited to attend today? Yeah, we'll send this presentation to Leanne from the county, and she was in charge of kind of the invitations, so she'll be able to help distribute the presentation. Yep. And this session was recorded as well, so that recording will be available by, I imagine, posted on the county website as well. We will stick around as long as we need to if folks have questions. Otherwise, thanks everyone for attending this noontime presentation. We weren't sure how many people would go for the noontime, but we had actually quite a lot. So thank you for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Oh, we saw a question here about change. There we go.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's perfect. Because I was like, people maybe want to see faces a little bit more than a generic slide. The question about work from home a little bit more. We definitely heard it hasn't changed people's interest in moving, and it's maybe actually heightened it because people have realized they want something different sometimes in their product type. We have seen some, I will say, I've heard a lot of chatter about it, probably mostly in more of like a lake resort type area, but individuals who are realizing they can work from anywhere and live pretty affordably. And so there is some of that. I think there's a few people that are kind of holding out just a little bit longer, but that is definitely something we've heard that could continue to drive demand in the Midwest, where we have people from the coast saying, I can live a lot cheaper in this part of the country and work, and it doesn't, because it doesn't matter where I work anymore. I think the other thing that we've kind of speculated on, and that is a little bit around rental design and multifamily design. So it was kind of a colliding of two pieces of this. Will people want to, will the desire for shared hallways, shared door, I got one access or two access points that I'm coming in, and then I go down a hall and there's multiple units off of it, that sort of thing. Will that continue to be as appealing? I haven't heard that has changed as much, but one of the interesting things that I'm hearing from some developers who are doing the missing middle type housing is that a lot of that type of housing, so we think about, some of the courtyard style, if you think about a courtyard multifamily or some duplexes, those sorts of things, they often don't have that common space. Which is actually a money saver for the developer because they don't have to maintain the common space. They don't have to be vacuuming it and cleaning it and sprinklering it and doing all of those things. So we might be seeing some of that change just because it can be a more affordable option to also get away from those things from when the developer's looking at long-term costs, not the front end, but the long-term maintenance costs of a property. So. Great. So Doug was asking about how to draw the developers and the risk takers. It's hard to say. It's a little bit different for every community, and how they want to approach that. The one advantage that Story County does have is that they are fairly, being closer to the Des Moines metro area gives you a pool of people who know how to do this type of work. So basically what they're looking for then is who's going to kind of give them the best deal, who's going to help them make the process easier, help them do something that might be new that they want to try. So that's the other thing of continuing to think about. It's no different than any other economic development, right? How do we do the things that are going to help maybe attract businesses and so forth? So a lot of times in more kind of rural isolated areas, that's where I really, really emphasize you're just going to probably have to figure out how to grow your own because, a contractor's not going to want to drive 2 hours from Des Moines to do a project here. So we got to figure out how to do it. The numbers just aren't going to begin to work for them. So there is a little bit of that advantage. And we've just seen other communities who say, let's put our economic development group together, just like, our employers and active individuals within our community got together to figure out how to bring jobs to our community. It's no different. How are we going to bring housing to our community? So we're going to get together. We're going to pool some funding together. We're going to find land. We're going to help with, every deal is different. So you got to kind of figure that part out of it. But I often have to say, you gotta start to think about and framing it in that same mindset we had, especially in the 1980s when we were trying to figure out how do we bring jobs, right, to our struggling ag communities. It's the same kind of mentality, I think. Well, thanks everyone.